Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is MCNICHOLS and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 13 waiver wire targets for the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, as we progress going into Week 13, many of us have to deal with the injuries that were sustained back in Week 12. Players like Brian Robinson Jr., Austin Eckler, Romeo Doubs, Josh Downs, Cedric Tillman, etc. But besides that, all of our players are back in our lineups as there are 0 teams facing a bye week in Week 13. So we should have our studs playing. But over the course of today's episode, besides talking about players, the best available at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defense going into Week 13, players that could potentially not only fill in for this week, but hopefully going into Week 14. Because going into Week 14, many of us have to face the unfortunate bye-apocalypse as there are 6 teams on bye. Those teams being the Commanders, Patriots, Colts, Texans, Broncos, and Ravens. Therefore, over the course of today's episode, besides mentioning players that can hopefully help our lineup in Week 13 in order to get us one step closer to the fantasy playoffs, we're going to be preparing for Week 14 in order to ensure that we make the fantasy playoffs and get one step closer to hoisting a 2024 fantasy football championship. So over the course of today's episode, we'll talk about players on an individual basis as I'll share with you guys statistics as to why I believe they should be picked up. Again, these are going to be players that are rostered in less than 50% of leagues. So again, if in fact your league is a smaller one, potentially 6, 8, or perhaps even sometimes 10 teams, there may be players that are available in your league that I'm not going to mention because I truly do believe they should already be rostered. But we'll go ahead and mention those players in specific. But outside of that, if you guys are looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description of the video. Down there, we have timestamps available like we do in every single video. While you're down there, be sure to subscribe to the channel because besides the daily content, we're also live streaming every single day. Later tonight, after the Baltimore Ravens take on the Los Angeles Chargers, I will be live here on the channel. If you have any questions in regards to Week 13, be sure to swing on by. I'm more than happy to help. Also, at the end of today's video, I'll also be putting together a couple entries in regards to tonight's game between the Baltimore Ravens and Los Angeles Chargers like we do every single Monday night. So if you guys want to go ahead, travel on over to the description of the video, click on the link heading on over to Underdog at this current moment in time. If you sign up using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first time deposit offer, tail the upcoming entries for tonight's game, but get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, flex rankings included. Again, all-encompassing rankings in order to help you set your lineups every single Sunday morning. So for those of you who are interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If in fact you are not eligible based on your current location, you can always find the rankings available via Patreon, link down in the description. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about the running back position going into Week 13. Now, I do want to preface before I begin with Tank Bigsby, if in fact a player like Jaylen Warren isn't already rostered in your league, again, this is a player that should already be rostered, but if they are not, that is the #1 priority. But assuming they are already rostered, considering on Yahoo and Sleeper formats, he is rostered in over 50% of leagues, we're going to continue on with our #1, Tank Bigsby, who has missed the last couple weeks due to injury and, of course, a bye week. Therefore, if somebody dropped him in your league, currently only rostered in 39% of Yahoo formats, 44% of Sleeper formats, in a situation in which he is available, I'm absolutely picking him up as the most valuable running back for the remainder of the season. When we look at the upcoming schedule of weeks 13 through 17, the upcoming matchups for the Jacksonville Jaguars are quite favorable in terms of the running game. Houston, Tennessee, New York Jets, Las Vegas Raiders, and of course the Tennessee Titans once again in Week 17. Therefore, there is an expectation that Tank Bigsby going into the upcoming matchups should find himself an abundance of overall success and opportunity. And considering these are going to be competitive matchups with the potential return of Trevor Lawrence, earlier this morning, Doug Peterson, the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars, did in fact say that Trevor Lawrence is going to be practicing over the course of the week, and they'll keep his status open going into this upcoming weekend. If there's a possibility that he's going to return in the coming weeks, it's only going to elevate this offense and specifically the running game, which certainly has found a lot of success with Tank Bigsby in the backfield. Over the course of this season, he's averaging 5.46 yards per carry. We've all seen him perform well, while ETN, on the other hand, has struggled over the course of this entire season. So with T-Law returning, Tank Bigsby coming back from his ankle injury, I think he's the most valuable running back that could potentially be picked up if, in fact, he is still available on the waiver wire. #2, TYJAE Spears. Now, this is another player that if in fact they are not on the available waiver wire position, it would not surprise me, primarily because, again, TYJAE Spears was out this last week due to the concussion protocol, so he was most likely placed within an IR spot in your league. But if in fact he was dropped, understand that going forward, when we look at the upcoming schedule for the Tennessee Titans, very similar to the Jacksonville Jaguars, they have a very favorable schedule up ahead. Weeks 13 through 17 consisting of the Commanders, Jaguars, Bengals, Colts, and Jaguars again. Again, very favorable matchups, and even matchups if in fact fact they're in negative game scripts, they're going to expect TYJAE Spears to get himself a lot of workload within the receiving game. Last time out in week 10 prior to his injury in week 11, he was given 10 touches that led to 51 total yards. Again, if he's going to be heavily utilized within the backfield, and considering how well Will Levis has played over the course of the last couple weeks here, obviously helping them defeat the Houston Texans yesterday, it's giving this offense momentum, and as we progress into the upcoming weeks, TYJAE Spears should certainly be of value for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 3, Roschon Johnson. Now, this is the final running back that I wanted to talk about in terms of a long-term basis for the remainder of the season. Obviously, we've talked about Roschon Johnson ad nauseum on this episode over the course of this entire season. We know he is the cleared away goal line back of the Chicago Bears, coming off of another consecutive game of a rushing touchdown. He has, in fact, scored 6 rushing touchdowns in the last 8 games for the Chicago Bears. So again, for the long term, he is still very much so valuable and someone that we want to address if, in fact, you are in a positional need for a running back going into week 14. Now that I've gone ahead and highlighted these 3 running backs, I want to talk about running backs that are specifically 1-week plays. Beginning with the Washington Commanders running back, Jeremy McNichols. Now, going into this week, there is an expectation that Austin Ekeler and Brian Robinson are both going to miss, not only because Brian Robinson got injured on the first play of the game and only played about 5 snaps before leaving the game with an apparent leg injury, but Austin Ekeler also sustained a concussion at the end of the game. Therefore, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Tennessee Titans, the expectation is that both Austin Ekeler and Brian Robinson Jr. are not going to be available, not only because they sustained injuries, but going into week 14, they have a bye week. So the expectation is that they're going to give them an additional week of rest in order to make sure that they can come back ready to go by week 15. Therefore, Jeremy McNichols, only rostered in 1% of leagues, is an immediate pickup in play as the primary starting running back of the Washington Commanders going into this upcoming weekend, in the absence, of course, of Brian Robinson and Austin Ekeler. Now, the other running back within this backfield who will be elevated from the practice squad and in the overall rotation is Chris Rodriguez Jr., who we have seen also, besides Jeremy McNichols, get himself a lot of opportunity in the absence of some of the running backs over the course of the season. So if we're going to be in a situation in which this two-headed monster finds success, do not be surprised as they do take on the Tennessee Titans, which is a solid matchup going into this upcoming weekend. Now we continue on with another player, AMEER Abdullah, one of our hidden gems from this most recent week. Now I know many of you watched that Hidden Gems live stream and were upset that we didn't have a full 6 players to talk about, but the 2 players that we did talk about at a full extent, AMEER Abdullah and Nick Westbrook-IKHINE, definitely played well. But as we progress, when we go into this upcoming week, the potential of AMEER Abdullah, who's already been picked up in 25% of Yahoo leagues, 33% of sleeper leagues, if in fact he was not picked up most recently, there's a possibility that going into week 13, both Alexander Madison and Zamir might miss another consecutive game. In the event in which that does occur, again, AMEER Abdullah coming off a week with 13 total touches, 8 on the ground, 5 through the air, found himself scoring a touchdown and scoring 15 fantasy points while playing 68% of the offensive snaps. Again, going into this upcoming week, if in fact Madison and White are going to be missing, Abdullah, an immediate pickup and play. Then we talk about the final player, an Eagles running back by the name of Kenneth Gainwell. Now, I understand last night he scored a rushing touchdown, but that's not why I want to potentially pick him up. I want to pick him up for the Week 14 Bipocalypse. Yes, is he a high-tier handcuff to Saquon Barkley, who's having himself an incredible season? Absolutely, but I don't want to pick him up for handcuff reasons. I want to pick him up because currently he's only rostered in 2% of Yahoo leagues, and the Week 14 Bipocalypse presents an opportunity to play him going up against the Carolina Panthers. Again, the Carolina Panthers are a top 5 matchup at the running back position. The last time that the Philadelphia Eagles blew out an opposing team back in week 7 against the New York Giants, we saw Kenneth Gainwell get himself 13 rushing attempts in that game, score himself 7.2 fantasy points, and even last night taking on the LA Rams, scoring 8.2 fantasy points. He has gotten himself more and more integration within this offense as late as they are tearing apart defenses within the running game. Gainwell has ran well behind this offensive line over the course of the season and is only going to continue to do so in week 14. Again, for those of you preparing for that upcoming week, do so with Kenneth Gainwell on roster. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver conversation. Let's begin with our number 1, Marquez Valdes-Scantling. But before I go ahead and talk about him, again, if players like Jerry Jeudy or Keon Coleman aren't already rostered, do yourself a favor. Again, those are players that are rostered in over 50% of leagues. If they're not already rostered, do yourself a favor. Please pick them up. All right, let's move on to our number 1, Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Of course, coming off of the bye week, if there's a possibility which teams did not pick him up or had to drop him because of all the teams that were on bye in week 12, potentially pick him up, because over the course of the last 2 games within this offense, again, 3 catches, 109, 2 touchdowns for 24.4 fantasy points in week 10. Week 11, 2 catches, 87 and a touchdown for 15.7 fantasy points. He's had himself a 67 and 71-yard reception for a touchdown in the last 2 games. And as long as he's going to continue to get those deep receiving opportunities, taking on the LA Rams this week is an advantageous matchup. Then we move on to Nick Westbrook-IKHINE, the second and the only other player that I mentioned as a hidden gem and an extent on Friday, which obviously continues his streak of scoring touchdowns. He has scored 1 touchdown minimum in 6 of the last 7 games, coming off of a week in which he had 2 catches for 48 and a touchdown. As long as Will Levis and this offense continues to play well, they have a very favorable schedule ahead overall, taking on Washington, Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indy, and Jacksonville again. The Washington matchup this upcoming weekend could be something that could cause a struggle, but going into Jacksonville, Cincinnati, the Colts, and Jacksonville again, I think is very favorable for him for the remainder of the season as he continues his streak of success for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 3, DEMARIO Douglas, also known as Pop Douglas, who again pretty much is a 7 to 9 point fantasy prospect in a half PPR. In a full PPR scoring from now more like 9 to 12 points every single week. Again, this is a player that is getting himself a high volume of overall receptions every time out, and because of that, is going to be hyper relevant every time. Again, regardless of the upcoming schedule and the week 14 bye, if you're in need of an immediate pickup and play at the wide receiver position, especially in a full PPR, DEMARIO Douglas is your guy. Then we have Rashod Bateman as our number 4. Look, Rashod Bateman plays later tonight. If in fact he is available, potentially pick him up because again, there's a possibility that you can use him in week 13. I understand that his fantasy value is 100% touchdown dependent, but so is someone like Nick Westbrook-IKHINE or MARQUEZ VALDES-SCANTLING. That's the point of the season that we're at. So when we talk about Rashod Bateman and the potential of his success, especially moving on even past their week 14 bye, weeks 15 through 17, they take on the Giants, the Steelers, and the Houston Texans. Again, very favorable matchups across the board, in my opinion, throughout that span of time. Then we move on to VELE, who has played incredibly well over the course of the season, only rostered in 5% of leagues, coming off of a game in which he had 80 receiving yards on 6 catches, 9 targets. Over the course of the last 3 games, putting up 11.9, 8.6, and 11.0 fantasy points in a half PPR, averaging 10.5 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks. Even with the return of Josh Reynolds this upcoming week from his injury stint, I'm expecting VELE to maintain his role within this offense as the number 2 only behind Courtland Sutton. Then we close out the top 6 conversation with Adam Thielen. The primary reason I wanted to mention Adam Thielen is because, again, even though last week he was limited in every single practice, he still managed to play 62% of the snaps. That number is only going to increase as the season progresses and he gets more comfortability with Bryce Young and this offense that has been hyper competitive over the course of the last 3 weeks here. Let's move on to number 7 through 9 at the wide receiver position. Players who I want to mention for weeks 14 in specific. In week 14, with 6 teams on bye, someone like Ray McLeod can be picked up and immediately played as they take on the Minnesota Vikings. It's a revenge game for Kirk Cousins in a game in which Ray McLeod in a full PPR can certainly be of value as a wide receiver 3. Then we move on to Tyler Boyd, who's found himself a lot of success as late, and as his offense continues to progress, Nick Westbrook-IKHINE, Calvin Ridley pulling a lot of attention, it has opened up opportunities for Tyler Boyd in that circumstance, taking on Jacksonville, who cannot stop opposing slot receiving options. Then the final option is Trey Tucker, with Aiden O'Connell taking over the quarterback position with Gardner Minshew's season-ending collarbone injury. The expectation is that, of course, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, an advantageous matchup at the wide receiver position, could be another pickup and play for week 14. All right, let's move on to the tight end and quarterback conversation, beginning with our number 1 tight end, Luke Schoonmaker. Again, I do want to mention that if players like Taysom Hill, Zach Ertz, or Will Dissly are not available in your league, then you move on to guys like Luke Schoonmaker, Noah Gray, and Theo Johnson. But if those 3 names that I mentioned, Taysom Hill, Zach Ertz, Will Dissly, are somehow available, please do yourself a favor and pick them up today. Taysom Hill and Dissly can be picked up before tonight's game because they're on a bye week or they haven't played. So do yourself that favor going into week 13. Now we'll begin with Luke Schoonmaker, who's coming off another consecutive game of fantastic fantasy production. Now, again, in week 11, had himself 10 targets, 6 catches, 56 in the absence of Jake Ferguson. Week 12, because of the concussion protocol holding out Jake Ferguson, we had Luke Schoonmaker find the end zone and score 13 fantasy points. Going into week 13, the Dallas Cowboys take on the New York Giants on Thursday afternoon. Therefore, Jake Ferguson is most likely not going to be able to clear the concussion protocol prior to that. Luke Schoonmaker, an immediate pickup and play if you need a tight end that has himself incredible potential for upside. Then we move on to Noah Gray, who has scored 4 receiving touchdowns in the last 2 games alone. His final 2 weeks has been 20.6 and 16.3 fantasy points. He typically plays about 50 to 70% of the overall offensive snaps, but as of late has been the red zone fiend of this offense, stealing all the value away from Travis Kelce. The fact of the matter is, as long as Patrick Mahomes continues to trust him and they are designing plays to get him open within the red zone, we would potentially trust him as an option, very similar to other tight ends who are very much so touchdown dependent in the top 16 conversation going into this week. Then we move on to Theo Johnson. Look, Theo Johnson did get himself 6 total targets of opportunity, didn't have the greatest overall performance against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which was an advantageous matchup, but it's purely just going to be a matter of how this offense is going to proceed in terms of who they want to prioritize within the passing game. Obviously, there wasn't much of a priority in the direction of like a Malik Neighbors Owanda Robinson, Darius Slayton. So hopefully Theo Johnson can get himself into the mix and get himself more opportunity as we progress, as they're potentially trying to give their younger players more looks going forward. But other than that, a player that can immediately also be played in a full PPR perhaps this week is Austin Hooper at the tight end position. Austin Hooper, the last 3 games in a half PPR, 7.9, 5.5, and 13.9. Again, I've had myself concerns with Hunter Henry over the course of the last 3 games, primarily because Austin Hooper is playing more snaps than ever and getting himself more targets and utilization than ever. It's just a matter of the quarterback looking in his direction on a consistent basis. If you're in need, Austin Hooper also available. Let's move on to the quarterback conversation as we begin with Trevor Lawrence, Russell Wilson, and Aaron Rodgers. I would assume that these guys are potentially rostered, but if in fact they are not, primarily because Trevor Lawrence was injured as of late and Aaron Rodgers was most recently on a bye week and Russell Wilson hasn't been the most productive quarterback as of late, if they're available, potentially pick them up because Trevor Lawrence, again, is expected to practice this week. If in fact he doesn't play this week against the Houston Texans, again, earlier this season, scored 2 touchdowns against the Texans. The Texans have allowed 7 of the last 10 quarterbacks that they have faced to score 2 or more touchdowns against them. If we're going to be in a position in which he's going to start this week, I'd immediately think that he is a potential top 20 quarterback option for us. Now, in regards to Russell Wilson taking on the Bengals, they've most recently given up performances to Justin Herbert, 297 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Lamar Jackson, 294 passing touchdowns. Russell Wilson could benefit from the fact that the Cincinnati Bengals secondary has struggled mightily. Then we move on to Aaron Rodgers, who has scored 2 touchdowns or more in 7 of the last 10 games he has played. They take on the Seahawks, who most recently shut down the Cardinals. And of course, we saw all the struggles that, of course, Aaron Rodgers and the Jets had with the Cardinals recently. But typically, the Seattle Seahawks defense doesn't play that well. So if, in fact, they're going to come back down to earth, Aaron Rodgers could still be of value. But under the assumption that these 3 quarterbacks are already rostered, you would then move on to Drake May, Will Levis, and or Derek Carr. Drake May, of course, has played incredibly well as of late, and as of the last couple performances, has been consistent. Now has an opportunity of taking on the Colts, which is an advantageous matchup. Then we move on to Will Levis, who again has to take on Washington this week, which could be challenging, but Dallas had themselves a favorable overall week. But going up into week 14 and beyond, that's specifically why I want to mention Will Levis. If in fact you need a quarterback for week 14, Will Levis would be the guy taking on Jacksonville. Then we talk about Derek Carr, week 14, takes on the New York Giants. I understand he plays the Rams this week, and Derek Carr's coming off of back-to-back games of 2 touchdowns, but week 14 is primarily why I want to talk about Derek Carr. Taking on the Giants could be very favorable for him and his overall potential for upside, and for those of us who need a quarterback, potentially pick him up. All right, let's close out today's video talking about kickers and defenses, not only for this week, but for beyond going into the fantasy playoffs. When we talk about the kickers going into this week, again, under the assumption that guys like Spencer Schrader, Will Lutz, and Tyler Bass are already rostered. Again, if somebody dropped Tyler Bass because he was on a bye week, this most recent performance, potentially pick him up. Otherwise, John Parker Romo, only rostered in 6% of Yahoo leagues, 2 of the last 3 games, has scored himself 13 or more fantasy points. Again, the one week that I suggested him as a hidden gem, he disappears. The other weeks, he's a 10-plus point player, as expected. Then we have Anders Carlson, who again, associated with the Jets, taking on the Seattle Seahawks this week, should be a competitive game and should lead to a lot of potential field goals for the Jets offense. Then we move on to EDDY PINEIRO, who's coming off of another double-digit fantasy point week. As long as the Carolina Panthers continue to stay competitive, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week could lead to a lot of field goals in the overall conversation. Then we move on to our defenses. We begin with the Dallas Cowboys, who take on the New York Giants on Thursday night. Again, the Thursday overall matchup against the Giants should be favorable, mainly because the Giants from weeks 5 through 12 have given up 8, 11, 15, 4, 15, 9, and 10 fantasy points to opposing defenses in fantasy. That's a 10.3 fantasy point per game average. Dallas, who only is rostered in 28% of leagues, should be a potential pickup in play going into Thursday night. Then we have the Los Angeles Rams, who take on the New Orleans Saints. I understand that the New Orleans Saints have played relatively well as of late, but the Rams, again, got embarrassed on Sunday Night Football and are going to turn it around going into week 13. As a defense from weeks 5 through 11, they have scored 10, 17, 6, 22, 7, and 9 fantasy points, 11.8 fantasy points per game throughout weeks 5 through 11 for the Rams defense. I'd expect them to get back to that overall pace. Then we move on to the Arizona Cardinals, who is a defense that I'm not only confident in going into this week's matchup against Minnesota, but specifically want to talk about them from weeks 14 and beyond. Again, when we talk about week 14 in the Bipocalypse, you want to potentially pick up the Arizona Cardinals because not only are they coming off of an 11-point performance against the Seattle Seahawks, but they've also scored 12 points in the 2 prior weeks. So they have scored over 11 fantasy points in each of the last 3 games as a defense. They take on Seattle in week 14, New England in week 15, Carolina in week 16, and the LA Rams in week 17. They are the playoff defense that I want to have on roster. Make sure to do yourself a favor and pick them up going into the fantasy playoffs. All right, with that all covered, let's close out today's video in regards to talking about some entries going into tonight's game in regards to the Baltimore Ravens taking on the Los Angeles Chargers for Monday Night Football. So I want to begin with this entry that I made earlier today. I did get a 0.5 total yards kind of reimbursement because I did have a play with Brian Robinson yesterday that all other legs hit, but unfortunately Brian Robinson left with an injury, but they did rescue the play and gave me this free one. So I got my money back and I have an opportunity of taking advantage of this play. Will Dissly going higher than 3.5 receptions. Obviously, we've ranked Will Dissly relatively high this week because I expect him to play incredibly well. From week 6 through 11, getting himself a 26% target rate, averaging 6.33 targets per game with an 80% catch rate. So under the assumption that he continues his average and gets himself 6 targets, he should have 5 receptions minimum tonight. 3.5 should be an easily accomplished number, especially considering they take on the Ravens, who have most recently allowed 4 catches for 66 to Pittsburgh tight ends, 11 for 72 to Cincinnati tight ends, 6 for 68 to Cleveland, 8 for 100 to Tampa Bay, and 4 for 68 to Washington Commanders tight ends. Their expectation is that, of course, with every other tight ends group succeeding in this overall category, and considering that Hayden Hurst is out tonight, even though Underdog has him within the list of plays as an anytime touchdown player, they haven't even compensated for the fact that Hayden Hurst is out. Therefore, I would expect that there's a possibility that this 3.5 number disappears. Take advantage of it before it disappears. Then we move on to Zay Flowers. Higher than 3.5 receptions is easily accomplishable over the course of the season thus far. In games in which he has 6 or more targets, 7 of those 8 games, he has got himself 4 or more receptions. Again, the most recent performance against the Pittsburgh Steelers was the only game in which he had 6 targets or more and didn't get himself 4 or more receptions. My expectation taking on the Chargers, the 7th best matchup at the wide receiver position, is that in a potential high scoring game, based on overall Vegas's totals, this is expected to be the 2nd highest scoring game of the week, that he should be able to accomplish at least 4 receptions within the upcoming contest. Then we move on to the second player I wanted to suggest, Ladd McConkey going higher than 49.5 receiving yards. Again, over the course of the season, in the 8 games in which Ladd McConkey has gotten himself 6 or more targets, he has gotten himself a base minimum of 5 or more receptions in 6 of those 8 games. Now, this is a reception conversation, but when we talk about yardage alone, when you're taking on the Baltimore Ravens, who are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, we have seen a guy like Justin Herbert have himself 275 or more passing yards in the last 4 consecutive games. The expectation is that Ladd McConkey should easily be able to surpass 50 receiving yards within the upcoming contest, considering he's going to get himself 5 receptions. A 10-yard per reception average should certainly be in the conversation going into tonight's game. Then we move on to J.K. Dobbins, who over the course of this season thus far has been able to go higher than 1.5 receptions in 7 of the last 8 games. That is an automatic. And then we close out with Derrick Henry, who has scored a touchdown in 11 of the last 11 games. 100% success rate within the category. Therefore, we throw him into the slip, and that's going to cover it. That'll cover my overall place going into tonight's game. If you want to potentially tail, again, there's a link down in the description. Heading on over to Underdog using code Andrew will not only allow you to potentially tail these picks, you'll get the first time deposit, match. You'll additionally go ahead and get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. All that available. Be sure to check it out today. Link down in the description. Outside of that, I'll be back tomorrow talking about the running back position at a top 36 capacity. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back later tonight as well after the game, talking all things fantasy via live stream. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.